The knife in Beatrice Keller's hand moved so fast that Flynn Everett almost missed the motion entirely, and by the time his mind caught up to what his eyes were seeing, 3 trout lay gutted and cleaned on the wooden board beside the creek while he was still working on his first. It was July of 1874, and Flynn had come down from his usual territory in the Wasatch Mountains to the small settlement of Alta, Utah, mainly because his supplies had run low, and partly because even a man who preferred solitude needed human voices occasionally. He had expected to fish alone at this tributary stream about a mile from town, the same spot he always used when he ventured down from the high country. What he had not expected was to find a woman already there, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, a leather apron tied around her waist, and a pile of cleaned fish that suggested she had been at this for some time. Flynn was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough that he had to turn sideways through some of the narrower passages in the mountains. His arms were corded with muscle from years of trapping, hauling, and surviving in conditions that would break lesser men. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather to keep it from his face, and his beard was thick, though he kept it trimmed short enough to be practical. He wore buckskin pants and a cotton shirt that had seen better days. The fabric stretched tight across his chest and arms. He had been proud of his fishing skills. Living alone in the wilderness meant a man had to be good at procuring food, and Flynn could skin a deer, trap a beaver, and yes, clean a fish with efficiency born of necessity. But watching this woman work made him feel like a clumsy child learning to hold a knife for the first time. She glanced up at him and he saw her eyes were a striking green, bright against her sun-touched skin. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid, though strands had escaped to frame her face. She was younger than him, he guessed, probably in her early 20s to his 28 years, but there was nothing soft or uncertain in the way she carried herself. "You planning to stare all day? Or are you going to finish that fish before it goes bad in the sun?" Her voice held amusement rather than hostility, and Flynn realized he had indeed been standing there with his knife hovering over the half-cleaned trout like an idiot. He cleared his throat and bent back to his task, but his hands felt awkward now, too aware of being observed. He made a cut that was deeper than intended, nearly piercing the intestines, and had to adjust quickly to avoid ruining the meat. Beatrice, though he did not know her name yet, had already finished 2 more fish in the time it took him to complete his first. She worked with a rhythm that spoke of countless repetitions, her movements economical and sure. The knife she used was clearly well maintained, the blade catching the sunlight as it moved. "You live up in the mountains?" she asked without looking up from her work. "I do," Flynn said, grateful for the distraction from his embarrassment. "Have a cabin about 15 miles northeast of here, up in the high country. Trapper? Used to be primarily. Still trap some, but mostly I hunt, fish, do some guiding for parties that want to cross the range." He finally finished his second fish and reached for a third, determined to at least improve his speed if he could not match hers. "I have been in Alta about 3 months," she said, and he heard the slight change in her voice that suggested those months had not been easy ones. "My father had consumption. We came west thinking the mountain air might help him. It did not." Flynn's hand stilled for a moment. "I am sorry. He passed 6 weeks ago." She said it matter-of-factly, but Flynn had lived alone long enough to recognize the sound of grief that had been compressed into something manageable. "Left me the claim he had filed on some land near here, and a cabin that needs more work than I know how to give it. But he also taught me how to fish, how to hunt, how to make my way. Said a woman needed to know how to survive on her own because depending on others was a dangerous thing." She finished another fish, added it to her pile. Flynn counted quickly and realized she had cleaned at least 20 in the time he had managed 4. "Your father taught you well," Flynn said, nodding toward her impressive pile. For the first time she smiled, and it transformed her entire face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. He was a fisherman back in Massachusetts before the war. Commercial fishing, the big boats that went out for days. He could clean fish in his sleep, I think. Used to make me practice until my hands cramped, then made me practice more. Said, if something was worth doing, it was worth doing better than anyone else. Flynn found himself smiling back. Wish I had known him, could have used those lessons myself. They worked in companionable silence for a while, though Flynn was acutely aware of her presence in a way that unsettled him. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to want to impress someone, to care what another person thought of his capabilities. Yet here he was, trying to increase his speed, to make his cuts cleaner, all because a woman he had known for less than an hour was showing him up at something he had thought himself competent at. The moment it happened, the moment everything changed, came so quietly that Flynn almost missed its significance. He had just finished his 8th fish, feeling somewhat better about his pace, when he glanced over to see Beatrice reaching for what must have been her 30th or 31st trout. Her hands moved in a blur of practiced motion, a cut to open the belly, fingers to scoop out the entrails, a quick rinse in the stream, and then onto the pile. The entire process took perhaps 15 seconds. Flynn's chest tightened with something he could not immediately name. It was not embarrassment at being surpassed, though that was certainly present. It was not simple admiration, though he felt that too. It was something deeper and more fundamental, a recognition that seemed to bypass his conscious mind entirely and lodge directly in his heart. He was looking at a woman who could survive out here, who did not need protection or coddling, who would not wilt at the first hardship or demand comforts the wilderness could not provide. A woman who understood that skill and competence were not luxuries but necessities, and who had devoted herself to mastery rather than mediocrity. A woman who could gut fish better and faster than him. And in that moment, with her hands bloody and efficient, her attention focused entirely on the task at hand, Flynn Everett fell completely and irrevocably in love. It was absurd, he knew. He had spoken perhaps 20 sentences to her. He did not even know her name. Yet the feeling was undeniable, settling into his bones with the certainty of sunrise. This was the woman he wanted beside him, not despite her capability, but because of it. This was the woman who could share his life in the mountains, who would understand why he chose solitude over civilization, who could be a true partner rather than a burden. The realization must have shown on his face, because when Beatrice glanced up, she frowned slightly. "Are you feeling well? You look strange." "I am fine," Flynn managed, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "Just realizing I have been doing this wrong for years." She laughed, a clear, bright sound that made his heart stumble. "It is just fish, no shame in learning a better way." But it was not just fish, not anymore. Flynn bent back to his work, trying to calm the sudden racing of his pulse. He needed to think clearly, to not do anything foolish. He could not simply announce to a woman he had just met that he wanted to marry her. That was the kind of behavior that got a man rightfully rejected or possibly shot. Instead, he focused on his fishing, on trying to absorb some of what he was witnessing. He watched the angle of her cuts, the way she used her fingers to scoop rather than trying to cut everything free, the efficient rinse that cleaned without excessive water waste. By his 10th fish, he had shaved a few seconds off his time. By his 15th, he had developed something approaching a rhythm. "Better," Beatrice said approvingly, and Flynn felt a ridiculous surge of pride at the single word. They fished until the sun had moved significantly westward and the pile of clean trout had grown substantial. Beatrice straightened finally, pressing a hand to her lower back and stretching. "That should be enough for now. I smoke most of them, sell some to the boarding house in Alta. Mrs. Chen pays fair prices, and she does not ask questions about a woman working alone." Flynn stood as well, aware of the way his muscles had stiffened from bending over the stream for so long. "I could help you carry them back to town. That is a heavy load for one person." She studied him for a long moment, and Flynn forced himself to meet her eyes steadily, to let her see whatever she needed to see to trust him. Finally, she nodded. "I would appreciate that. My name is Beatrice Keller, Flynn Everett." He held out his hand and she shook it without hesitation, her grip firm and her palm calloused from work. They divided the fish between 2 baskets, and Flynn insisted on taking the heavier load. Beatrice did not argue, which he appreciated. Some women would have protested out of pride or propriety, but she simply acknowledged his greater strength with a practical nod and led the way toward Alta. The town was small even by frontier standards, a collection of buildings clustered along a single main street, with various claims and cabins scattered in the surrounding area. It had started as a mining settlement, though the silver deposits had proven less rich than initially hoped. Now it persisted mainly through stubbornness and the fact that it offered supplies and services to trappers, hunters, and the occasional party trying to cross the mountains. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a sturdy 2-story building near the center of town, with a restaurant on the first floor that served the best food available for 50 miles. She was a Chinese woman who had come to America with her husband during the railroad construction, and she had stayed after his death because, as she put it, Someone needed to feed people properly, and it might as well be her. She came out when she heard them approaching, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a small woman, barely reaching Flynn's chest, but she had an air of competence and authority that made her seem much larger. "Beatrice, good timing. I have guests arriving tomorrow, and I promised them fresh fish." Her eyes moved to Flynn, assessing him in one quick glance. "Flynn Everett, I have not seen you in town for 3 months. Have been up in the high country, Mrs. Chen. Just came down for supplies, and to help carry fish, apparently." There was amusement in her voice, and Flynn felt his neck heat slightly. Mrs. Chen's missed nothing, and she was already drawing conclusions about his interest in Beatrice. They carried the fish to the cold room behind the boarding house, where Mrs. Chen examined them with a critical eye before nodding in satisfaction. "Excellent work, as always, Beatrice. I will take 2 dozen. She named a price that was fair without being generous, and Beatrice accepted with a nod. As they walked back outside, Beatrice carrying the remaining fish, Flynn made a decision. "Where is your cabin? I meant what I said about helping with repairs if you need it." She hesitated, and he could see her weighing caution against need. "About 2 miles west of here, up in the foothills. There is a roof leak I have been trying to patch, and the chimney needs repointing before winter. But I cannot pay you. Money is tight right now." "I was not asking for payment," Flynn said. "Just offering help." "Why?" The question was direct, her green eyes searching his face. Flynn could have dissembled, could have offered some practical excuse about neighboring obligations or Christian charity. Instead, he chose honesty. "Because I would like to get to know you better, and working alongside someone is the best way I know to do that." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around her eyes. "All right, but I warn you, it is hard work, and I expect anyone helping me to do the job properly." "I would not have it any other way," Flynn said, and he meant it. They agreed he would come by the following morning, and Beatrice gave him directions to her claim. Then she headed off with her basket of remaining fish, presumably to smoke them, and Flynn went to secure his supplies and a room for the night. He found himself in the general store, gathering flour, salt, ammunition, and the other necessities of mountain life. But his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing Beatrice's hands moving over those fish, the sure confidence of her movements. Kept hearing her voice as she spoke of her father, matter of fact about grief, but not diminished by it. "You look like a man with something on his mind," said Thomas Grant, who ran the store. He was a balding man in his 50s with a shrewd eye for both business and gossip. "Just thinking about repairs," Flynn said, which was not entirely a lie. The Keller place could use them. Heard her father built that cabin mostly himself, but he was already sick by then, not the quality work it could have been. Thomas wrapped the flour in brown paper. "She is a hard worker, that girl. Out before dawn most days, fishing or hunting. Keeps to herself mostly, which has some of the town ladies talking." Flynn felt a flash of irritation. "Talking about what? You know how people are. Woman alone, no family, working like a man. They think it is improper. Some think she should have gone back east after her father died, found some relatives to take her in. But she filed the claim in her own name, legal and proper, and there is nothing anyone can do about it." "Good," Flynn said firmly. "A woman has as much right to work a claim as a man." Thomas grinned. "I figured you would see it that way. You mountain folk tend to be more practical about such things." He added up the supplies. "That will be $4.30. Flynn paid and carried his goods to the small hotel next to the boarding house. It was run by a German couple, the Schmidts, who provided clean rooms and did not pry into their guests' business. He stored his supplies, washed the fish smell from his hands, and then found himself too restless to stay indoors. He ended up walking the perimeter of the town, which did not take long, and then continuing up into the foothills just to move, to think. The sun was setting by the time he found a boulder to sit on, looking out over Alta and the valley beyond. Flynn had been alone for a long time. After the war, after seeing what men could do to each other when ideology and desperation combined, he had wanted nothing more than to get away from people. He had headed west, kept going until he found mountains high enough and wild enough to suit him, and he had built a life there. It was a good life, a simple one. He answered to no one, depended on no one, and had convinced himself that was exactly how he wanted things, but watching Beatrice today had reminded him of something he had tried to forget. That solitude, while peaceful, was not the same as contentment. That there was a difference between being alone by choice and being lonely. He wanted to know everything about her. What she thought about when she was working, what made her laugh, what her dreams had been before circumstances forced her into survival mode. He wanted to hear her voice across a breakfast table, to work beside her on the endless tasks that frontier life demanded, to fall asleep knowing she was within reach. It was too much, too fast, and he knew it. But knowing something intellectually did not change what the heart wanted. The next morning, Flynn was at Beatrice's cabin just after sunrise, his tools packed in a leather satchel. The cabin was indeed rough, built from logs that had not been properly trimmed and chinked with mud that was already cracking in places. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and he could see the chimney stones were loose even from a distance. Beatrice emerged as he approached, her hair still wet from washing, wearing a simple cotton dress that was patched in places but clean. "You are early." "Habit," Flynn said. "Mountains teach you to use all the daylight you can get." She smiled. "I have coffee if you want some before we start." They sat on the rough bench outside her cabin, drinking coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead, and Flynn felt a strange peace settle over him. This, he thought, was what he had been missing. Not just companionship, but this specific person in this specific place. "Where do you want to start?" he asked. "The roof. If we get heavy rains before I fix it, everything inside will be ruined." They spent the morning on the roof, pulling up damaged shingles and replacing them with new ones Beatrice had already cut. She worked alongside him without complaint, hauling materials, holding boards steady while he nailed them down. She was not as strong as him, but she was quick and smart, anticipating what he would need before he asked. As they worked, they talked. Flynn learned that Beatrice's mother had died when she was young. She had grown up essentially raising herself while her father worked. She had taught herself to read from the Bible and whatever newspapers she could find, had learned mathematics by helping calculate catch weights and prices. She had wanted to be a teacher once, but her father's illness had ended those dreams. "Do you regret it?" Flynn asked, hammering in a nail with more force than necessary. "Coming west, staying here instead of going back east." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, staring out at the mountains that rose beyond her small claim. "I regret that my father suffered. I regret that he died before he could see this place in spring, which he always said would be beautiful. But regret staying? No. Back east I would have had to marry whoever would take a poor girl with no dowry, or I would have ended up in a factory or as a domestic servant. Here, at least I have a chance to build something of my own." Flynn understood that. It was why he had come west too, in his own way. The chance to be more than what circumstances had prescribed. They finished the roof by early afternoon, and Flynn inspected the chimney while Beatrice made them lunch. The stones were indeed loose, the mortar having crumbled over time and weather. He began mixing new mortar, the familiar work soothing in its repetition. Beatrice brought out bread and cheese and more coffee, and they ate sitting on the ground with their backs against the cabin wall. Flynn was aware of her shoulder nearly touching his, of the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when it escaped her braid. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. "Anything. Why did you really offer to help me? I know you said you wanted to get to know me better, but men usually want something specific when they say things like that." Flynn set down his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "I am not going to lie to you, Beatrice. I am hoping that getting to know you better might lead to courting you, if you were willing. But that is not conditional on you feeling the same way. I am helping because your cabin needs help and I can provide it. What happens beyond that is entirely up to you." She studied him for a long moment, and Flynn forced himself to hold still under her scrutiny to let her see his sincerity. "I appreciate the honesty," she said finally. "Most men would have pretended they were just being neighborly, then gotten angry when I did not respond the way they wanted. So I will be honest too. I do not know you well enough yet to know if I want to be courted. But I am not opposed to the possibility." It was not a declaration of love, but it was not a rejection either, and Flynn felt his heart lift. "That is all I could ask for." They went back to work, but something had shifted between them, a tension that was not uncomfortable but was certainly present. Flynn found himself hyper-aware of every time their hands brushed, every time Beatrice leaned close to inspect his work. He spent 3 more days at her cabin, working from dawn until dusk. He repointed the entire chimney, fixed the door so it hung properly, reinforced the weak spots in the walls. Beatrice worked alongside him when she could, and hunted or fished when she could not, always returning with something for their dinner. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat outside watching the sun set over the mountains, Beatrice said, "You have done more than enough. I cannot ask you to keep neglecting your own work for mine. I need to head back up to my cabin tomorrow anyway," Flynn admitted. "I have traps to check and supplies to store properly, but I will be back in town in 2 weeks. Maybe we could fish together again?" "I would like that," Beatrice said, and her smile made the upcoming 2 weeks of solitude seem suddenly very long indeed. Flynn left at first light the next morning, but not before Beatrice gave him a package of smoked fish for his journey. "So you do not forget who the better fisherman is," she said, her eyes sparkling with humor. "I am not likely to forget that," Flynn said, and he meant it in more ways than one. The journey back to his cabin took most of the day, and Flynn spent it replaying every conversation, every smile, every moment of working alongside Beatrice. He had been attracted to women before, had even thought himself in love once or twice, but this felt different. This felt like recognition, like finding something he had not known he was searching for. His cabin was exactly as he had left it, a sturdy structure he had built himself over the course of several months, situated in a high valley with good water and excellent hunting. It had everything he needed for a solitary life: a solid roof, a good fireplace, storage for food and furs, a comfortable bed. But for the first time since building it, the cabin felt empty rather than peaceful. He found himself thinking about how Beatrice would improve this or that, where she might place her fishing equipment, how her voice would sound echoing off these particular mountains. He threw himself into work, checking his trap lines, hunting, gathering firewood for the coming winter. The 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness, each day measured out in hours that seemed longer than usual. Finally, it was time to return to Alta. Flynn packed his furs and the few trade goods he had prepared, and he made the journey in record time, arriving in town just after midday. He went first to trade his furs at the general store, then to the boarding house to secure a room. Mrs. Chen took one look at his face and shook her head with a knowing smile. "She is at the creek, same place you met her." Flynn did not ask how Mrs. Chen knew who he was looking for. He simply thanked her and headed straight for the tributary stream. Beatrice was indeed there, her basket already half full of cleaned fish. She looked up when she heard him approach, and her face broke into a genuine smile that made Flynn's breath catch. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." He set down his pack and pulled out his knife. "Ready to show me up again?" she laughed. "Always." They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side. Flynn had practiced during his time alone, trying to improve his technique, and he was gratified to see he had gotten noticeably faster. He still was not as quick as Beatrice, but the gap had narrowed. "You have been practicing," she said approvingly. "Had a good teacher, even if the lesson was mostly watching her work." They fished and talked, and Flynn learned more about her. That she had a small vegetable garden she was trying to establish, that she had shot a deer the previous week and traded most of the meat for other supplies, that she had been reading a battered copy of Ivanhoe she had found among her father's belongings. When they finished, Flynn again helped carry the fish to Mrs. Chen, and then he walked Beatrice back toward her cabin. At the edge of town, she stopped and turned to face him. "Would you like to come for dinner? It is just venison stew, nothing fancy, but you are welcome to share it." Flynn knew what she was really asking, whether he was interested in continuing what they had started and seeing where this tentative connection might lead. "I would like that very much." The cabin looked better than when he had left it, and he felt a surge of satisfaction knowing his work had contributed to that. Beatrice had clearly been busy as well. There were curtains in the windows now, and the interior was cleaner and more organized. The stew was excellent, rich and hearty, and they ate while talking about everything and nothing. Flynn told her about his cabin in the high country, about the time he had encountered a grizzly bear and had to hide in a tree for 6 hours, about the summer he had guided a scientific expedition and learned the Latin names for half the plants in the territory. Beatrice told him about growing up in a Massachusetts fishing town, about the smell of the ocean and how different it was from the mountain air. She told him about the war years, about watching men leave and not return, about her father coming home changed and sick and determined to find a better place to die. "He did not think of it that way," she said quickly. "He always said he was looking for a better place to live. But I knew. I think he knew I knew." Flynn reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "He gave you skills that have kept you alive and independent. That is a gift most fathers do not think to give their daughters." Her fingers turned, threading through his. "I know. I just wish I had been able to save him. Consumption does not care how skilled or determined you are. It takes who it takes." Flynn had seen enough death to know that truth intimately. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still linked across the table. Then Beatrice squeezed his fingers and stood. "It is getting late. You should probably head back to town before it is full dark." Flynn stood as well, reluctant to leave but knowing she was right. "Can I see you tomorrow?" "I will be here." He walked back to Alta in the gathering dusk, and he felt lighter than he had in years. This was courting, he realized. Not the formal chaperoned version that happened in cities, but the frontier equivalent. Two people choosing to spend time together, to learn each other, to see if what they felt could become something lasting. Over the next several weeks, a pattern developed. Flynn would spend a week or so at his cabin, working his trap lines and maintaining his own property. Then he would come to Alta for a few days, and he and Beatrice would fish together, work on her cabin together, share meals together. Sometimes they would go hunting, and Flynn discovered that Beatrice was a decent shot with a rifle, though not as strong with a bow. He taught her what he knew, and she proved a quick study. The people of Alta grew accustomed to seeing them together. Some of the town ladies still whispered about propriety, but Mrs. Chen and others defended Beatrice, pointing out that she conducted herself with perfect respectability and that having a man who could help with heavy work was simple common sense. What Flynn loved most was how easy it all felt. There was no pretense between them, no games of the sort he had heard courting involved. Beatrice said what she thought and expected him to do the same. If she was tired or frustrated, she said so. If she disagreed with him, she argued her point clearly and expected him to listen, and he loved watching her work. Whether she was gutting fish or chopping vegetables or sewing patches on her clothing, she brought that same focused competence to everything. She did not do things halfway or carelessly. It was a trait Flynn understood deeply, one that resonated with his own approach to life. Summer deepened into early autumn, and the aspens began to turn gold on the mountainsides. Flynn knew he needed to have a serious conversation soon, before the heavy snows came and traveling between Alta and his cabin became dangerous or impossible. He chose an evening when they had been fishing together, when the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red across the western sky. They were sitting on the bank of the stream, their day's work done, just enjoying the peace. "Beatrice," he said, his heart hammering despite his attempt at calm, "I need to ask you something important." She turned to look at him, her expression open and curious. "All right, I love you." The words came out more bluntly than he had planned, but he had never been good at flowery speeches. "I have loved you since the first day I met you, when I watched you gut fish with more skill than I will ever have. I love your competence and your honesty and your strength. I love how you do not back down from hard work, and I love how you are not afraid to be exactly who you are." Beatrice's eyes had gone wide, but she did not speak, so Flynn pressed on. "Winter is coming, and that means months when I will not be able to get down from the high country to see you. I do not want to spend those months apart. I want you to come with me. And before you think I am just asking you to live with me without marriage, I am not. I am asking you to marry me, to be my wife, to share my life in whatever form that takes." He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a ring he had commissioned from the blacksmith in Alta, a simple band of silver with a small piece of polished turquoise set into it. "I know it is not fancy, but I thought you might prefer something practical that you could actually wear while working." Beatrice took the ring, turning it over in her fingers, and Flynn held his breath. They had been courting for over 2 months now, but that did not guarantee she would say yes. She had her own claim, her own independence. He was asking her to give that up to come live in an isolated cabin miles from any town. "Can I ask you some questions before I answer?" she said finally. "Anything. Your cabin, how big is it?" "One large room with a sleeping loft. There is space to expand if needed. Water source, a spring-fed creek about 50 yards away. Never freezes completely, even in the worst cold. Hunting and fishing. Excellent for both. Deer, elk, the occasional bear. Trout in the creek, bigger fish in the lake about a mile west. How isolated are we talking? If something went wrong, could we get help?" Flynn appreciated the practicality of her questions. This was not a woman caught up in romantic fantasy. This was a woman assessing whether she could survive and thrive in the situation he was proposing. "In summer there is a Ute camp about 10 miles south, and I am on good terms with them. We could reach them in a day if we had to. In winter we would be entirely on our own from November through March, maybe into April, depending on the snow. It is not an easy life, Beatrice. I would not lie to you about that. Would you expect me to give up fishing and hunting? To stay in the cabin and just cook and clean?" God, no. I would expect you to do what you do best, which is help us survive. I would expect us to work together the way we have been. Although I admit I would appreciate it if you would teach me more of your fish cleaning technique, because even with practice I am still too slow. That surprised a laugh out of her, and some of the tension in Flynn's chest eased. What about my claim here? She asked. I worked hard for this land. Keep it. File the papers to hold it, and we can come down each summer to maintain the cabin and plant crops if you want. Or sell it and use the money for supplies. That choice is yours. Beatrice looked down at the ring again, then up at the mountains rising behind them, then back at Flynn. You really love me? Even though we have only known each other a few months, I really love you. I think I have been waiting for you without knowing it, and when I saw you that first day, everything just clicked into place. I need you to understand something, Beatrice said slowly. I am not always easy to live with. I get focused on tasks and forget to talk. I have strong opinions and I will argue for them. I had years of living with just my father, of not having to compromise or consider another person's wants. I might not be good at this, at being a wife, and I have been living alone in the mountains for 6 years, so I am probably not going to be good at being a husband, but I think we can figure it out together if you are willing to try. Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, and Flynn felt every second stretch out like an eternity. Then she slipped the ring onto her finger, and she smiled. Yes, I will marry you, Flynn Everett. The relief and joy that flooded through Flynn was so intense he felt lightheaded. He pulled her into his arms and she came willingly, her head tucking perfectly under his chin. She was solid and real and warm, and she was going to be his wife. When? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Soon, before the heavy snows come if possible. I do not want a big ceremony, just something legal and binding. They were married a week later in the front room of Mrs. Chen's boarding house, with Thomas Grant and the town minister as witnesses. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen had altered for her, and Flynn had trimmed his hair and beard and wore the cleanest clothes he owned. The ceremony was brief and practical, much like the woman he was marrying. They exchanged vows, signed the necessary papers, and then Mrs. Chen insisted on providing a wedding dinner for them and the handful of people who had come. Flynn could not stop looking at his wife. His wife. Beatrice Everett now, though she had quietly mentioned she might keep Keller for some purposes, since she had filed her claim under that name. Flynn did not care what name she used as long as she wore his ring. They spent their wedding night in Flynn's room at the hotel, which felt strange and too civilized after months of outdoor work and campfires. But Beatrice came into his arms with the same straightforward honesty she brought to everything. And if there was awkwardness, it was the kind that came from newness rather than unwillingness. Afterward, lying in the narrow bed with Beatrice's head on his shoulder, Flynn felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening. He had not known it was possible to be this happy. We should leave the day after tomorrow, Beatrice said sleepily. That gives us 1 day to finalize supplies and make sure we have not forgotten anything critical. Always practical, his wife, Flynn smiled in the darkness, agreed. They spent the next day in a flurry of preparation. Flynn had been stockpiling supplies for weeks, knowing he would need to provision for 2 if Beatrice said yes. Now they added her personal belongings, her tools, her precious books. They could not take everything, so Beatrice arranged for Mrs. Chen to store some items until spring. The morning they left, half the town came to see them off. Mrs. Chen hugged Beatrice fiercely and told Flynn he had better take good care of her or answer to an angry Chinese woman, which everyone knew was the most fearsome threat in the territory. Thomas Grant gave them a generous discount on their final supply purchases. Even some of the town ladies who had gossiped about Beatrice's propriety came to wish her well, their concerns apparently soothed by the wedding ring on her finger. The journey to Flynn's cabin took a day and a half of steady travel. Beatrice rode a sturdy mare Flynn had purchased for her, and they led a pack mule loaded with supplies. The path climbed steadily into the mountains, following game trails and streambeds, passing through aspen groves and pine forests. Flynn watched Beatrice carefully for signs of doubt or fear as they got further from civilization, but she seemed fascinated rather than frightened. She asked questions about the plants and animals they saw, about how he had found this particular route, about what the territory looked like in winter. They camped one night in a sheltered hollow, and Flynn showed Beatrice how he built a fire that would stay lit all night, how to string a perimeter alarm using bells and string that would warn them if anything large approached. She learned quickly, as he had known she would. The cabin came into view late on the second day, nestled in its high valley with smoke already rising from the chimney. Flynn had paid a young Ute man to come up a few days earlier and get the place ready, to light fires and air things out and ensure no animals had taken up residence during Flynn's absence. "It is beautiful," Beatrice said, and Flynn heard the genuine wonder in her voice. The cabin was beautiful, at least to someone who appreciated the wilderness. Mountains rose on three sides, their peaks already touched with early snow. The valley itself was green and gold with late-season grass and turning aspens. The creek Flynn had mentioned ran clear and cold, its sound a constant gentle murmur. They unloaded the mule and horse, got the animals settled in the small corral Flynn had built, and then Beatrice went inside while Flynn finished the outdoor tasks. He found her standing in the middle of the cabin's main room, turning slowly to take everything in. Flynn tried to see it through her eyes. The stone fireplace that dominated one wall, the rough-hewn furniture he had built himself, the sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, the shelves lined with supplies and equipment. It was clean and functional, but it was undeniably rustic. "What do you think?" he asked, suddenly nervous. Beatrice smiled. "I think it is going to be a good winter." They fell into a routine over the following weeks, learning to work together in the confines of the cabin and the surrounding valley. Flynn checked his trap lines and Beatrice often went with him, learning the routes and the signs to look for. They hunted together, and Beatrice proved her earlier skill had not been a fluke. She brought down a young elk with a single clean shot that Flynn might have missed. They fished together in the creek and the lake, and Flynn still marveled at watching her work. Her hands had lost none of their speed or efficiency, and she taught him tricks and techniques his pride had prevented him from asking about before. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Beatrice would read aloud from her books while Flynn worked on repairing equipment or preparing furs. Sometimes they would just talk, sharing stories from their lives before they met, learning the small details that courtship had not covered. Flynn learned that Beatrice had a beautiful singing voice and would sometimes sing while she worked. He learned that she was terrified of spiders, but not at all afraid of bears. He learned that she had a sharp sense of humor that came out in unexpected moments, making him laugh until his sides hurt. Beatrice learned that Flynn had been a soldier during the war, that he had seen things that still haunted him sometimes. She learned that he had a gift for woodworking and had made every piece of furniture in the cabin. She learned that he was surprisingly gentle with injured animals, once spending weeks nursing a wounded hawk back to health before releasing it. The first major snowstorm hit in mid-November, dumping 3 feet of snow overnight and effectively cutting them off from the outside world. Flynn had been through many such winters, but he watched Beatrice carefully for signs of panic or claustrophobia. She stood at the window, watching the snow fall, and then turned to him with shining eyes. "I have never seen anything so beautiful." They made love that night with the storm howling outside, and Flynn thought that he had finally found his place in the world. Not just a geographic location, but a sense of belonging that came from being with the right person. Winter deepened, and the snow continued to fall. They were indeed isolated now, entirely dependent on themselves and their preparations. But Flynn had planned well, and Beatrice's contributions had made their stores even more robust. They had plenty of food, plenty of firewood, plenty of everything they needed to survive. What surprised Flynn was how much he enjoyed the isolation now that he had someone to share it with. He had always treasured his solitude, but having Beatrice there did not diminish that peace. Instead, it enhanced it, adding a dimension he had not known was missing. They had their difficulties, of course. Beatrice did indeed get intensely focused on tasks and would snap if interrupted at the wrong moment. Flynn discovered he had habits ingrained from years of living alone that were harder to break than he had anticipated. They argued sometimes, usually about trivial things made larger by the cabin's close quarters, but they learned to apologize, to compromise, to give each other space when needed, and they learned that arguments could be followed by reconciliation, that disagreement did not mean disaster. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly with a special dinner Beatrice prepared and small gifts they had made for each other. Flynn gave her a beautifully carved box for storing her fishing gear. Beatrice gave him a new leather sheath for his hunting knife, stitched with painstaking care. "I am not very good at sewing," she admitted, "but I wanted to make you something useful." Flynn examined the sheath, noting the careful stitching, the reinforced edges that would prevent wear. "It is perfect." They made love in the sleeping loft while the fire burned low below, and Flynn thought that this was what happiness felt like. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but this quiet contentment, this bone-deep certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. January brought the deepest cold, temperatures dropping so low that the water bucket would freeze solid overnight despite being inside near the fire. They had to break ice on the creek to get water for the animals, had to be careful not to stay outside too long lest frostbite set in, but they had each other, and they had their routines, and the days passed with a rhythm that was almost meditative. It was during one of these deep winter days that Beatrice got sick. It started as a simple cold, or so they thought, but within 2 days she was feverish and coughing hard enough to make Flynn's chest ache in sympathy. He cared for her with all the skill he possessed, keeping her warm, making her drink water and broth even when she did not want to, applying cool cloths to her fevered forehead. He barely slept, terrified that he would lose her the way she had lost her father. On the 3rd day, when her fever finally broke, Flynn found himself shaking with relief. Beatrice opened her eyes, clear for the first time in days, and found him sitting beside the bed with his head in his hands. "Flynn?" Her voice was rough from coughing. "Are you all right?" He looked up, and he knew his eyes were wet, but he did not care. "I thought I was going to lose you." She reached for his hand, her grip weak but present. "I am tougher than that. Did you think I would let a little fever take me down?" But Flynn had seen strong people felled by illness, had seen how quickly things could go wrong in the wilderness. "Promise me you will never do that again." "I cannot promise that. But I can promise that I will fight like hell to stay with you." He climbed into the bed beside her, careful of her still fragile state, and held her close. "That is all I ask." Beatrice recovered slowly, regaining her strength over the course of the next week. Flynn insisted she rest even after she declared herself well enough to work, and for once she did not argue with him. February brought slightly warmer temperatures and the first hints that winter might eventually end. They were both getting restless by then, ready for the freedom of movement that spring would bring. But the snow was still too deep for travel, so they stayed put and continued their routines. It was during this time that Beatrice first mentioned children. They were sitting by the fire and she was mending one of Flynn's shirts while he sharpened knives. "Have you thought about children?" she asked, not looking up from her stitching. Flynn's hands stilled. "I have thought about it. Have you?" "Yes. I think I would like to have a family, if you would. Not right away necessarily, but eventually. I would like that too," Flynn said carefully. "But I want you to understand what it would mean, raising children this far from town. No doctor readily available, no school, limited supplies. It would not be easy. Nothing about this life is easy," Beatrice said, finally looking up at him. "But that does not make it not worth doing. My father raised me essentially alone, and I turned out all right. I think we could manage anything together," Flynn said, and he meant it. Spring arrived slowly, the snow retreating inch by inch up the mountainsides. The creek ran high with meltwater, too dangerous to fish until it calmed. But the world was waking up, birds returning, new growth pushing through the last of the snow, and the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a home base for exploration. They ventured out more, relearning the valley in its spring colors. Beatrice exclaimed over the wildflowers that bloomed in profusion once the snow receded, and Flynn showed her the best places to find the first fresh greens that would supplement their winter-stored diet. In late April, when the high passes were finally clear enough for travel, they made the journey down to Alta. Beatrice wanted to check on her cabin and her stored belongings, and Flynn needed to trade furs and gather supplies. The town greeted them with enthusiasm, and Flynn could not help but notice the way people looked at Beatrice with new respect. She had survived a winter in the high country, which not everyone could do, and she looked healthy and happy, which spoke well of Flynn's care. Mrs. Chen hugged them both and demanded every detail of their winter. Beatrice's cabin had weathered the season well, requiring only minor repairs that Flynn completed in a single day. They retrieved her stored items and decided which to keep and which to sell. They spent a week in Alta, enjoying the relative luxury of prepared meals and seeing other people, but Flynn found he was ready to return to the mountains before the week was out. And when he mentioned it to Beatrice, she nodded immediately. "I miss it," she said. "The quiet. I never thought I would say that, but I do." They restocked their supplies, traded Flynn's furs for a good price, and headed back up to the high country. The summer was glorious. They fished and hunted, expanded the garden plot Flynn had started years ago, and made various improvements to the cabin. Flynn built on an additional room, giving them more space and privacy. Beatrice started smoking fish on a larger scale, building up stores for the next winter. They had visitors occasionally. Members of the Ute band Flynn had mentioned, who were friendly and willing to trade. Beatrice learned a few words of their language, and Flynn was pleased to see how easily she interacted with them, without fear or condescension. In late July, Beatrice announced she was pregnant. Flynn had been checking a trap line and returned to find her sitting outside the cabin with a strange expression on her face. "Is something wrong?" he asked immediately, going to her side. "No, nothing is wrong. I am pregnant. I am fairly certain." Flynn sat down hard on the ground beside her bench. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. All the signs are there." She looked at him, her expression somewhere between excited and terrified. "Are you happy about this?" He reached for her, pulling her into his arms. "I am terrified and thrilled and about a dozen other things all at once. But yes, I am happy. Are you?" "Yes, scared, but happy." They held each other as the sun set over the mountains, and Flynn made silent promises to this child he had not yet met, that he would protect them, teach them, give them the skills they needed to survive and thrive, that he would love them the way his own father had loved him, and better where he could. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into the winter. Beatrice had some morning sickness early on, but it passed quickly, and she remained active and healthy. She still insisted on helping with the work, and Flynn learned to let her make her own decisions about what she could handle, stepping in only when she asked for help. They prepared as much as they could, making soft baby clothes from scraps of fabric, building a small cradle, stockpiling supplies. Flynn had never been so aware of the risks of frontier life, of all the things that could go wrong. But Beatrice seemed confident, and he tried to draw strength from that. The baby came in early March, during a late winter storm that reminded Flynn viscerally that they were entirely on their own. But Beatrice had studied the medical book they had purchased in Alta, and she coached Flynn through what needed to be done. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Flynn's fear threatened to overwhelm him. But Beatrice was strong, stronger than he had imagined possible, and when the baby finally emerged, crying lustily, Flynn felt tears streaming down his face. "A girl," Beatrice said, exhausted but smiling. "We have a daughter." They named her Clara, after Beatrice's mother, and she was perfect in the way all parents think their children are perfect. She had Beatrice's green eyes and Flynn's dark hair, and a fierce determination that showed even in infancy. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful and harder than Flynn had anticipated. Clara needed constant care, and they were both learning as they went, but they worked together, trading off responsibilities, supporting each other through the difficult nights and celebrating the small victories. Summer came again, and they made their annual trip to Alta with Clara bundled carefully for the journey. Mrs. Chen cried when she saw the baby, and half the town came by to meet little Clara Everett. "You did it," Mrs. Chen said to Beatrice, holding Clara with practiced ease. "You built a life up there, a real life. We built it together," Beatrice said, looking at Flynn with such love that he felt his heart might burst. The years that followed fell into a pattern. Winters in the high country, summers split between their mountain cabin and visits to Alta. They had 2 more children, a son they named Daniel and another daughter they named Margaret. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Flynn built a small schoolhouse structure where Beatrice taught the children to read and write and calculate. Clara grew into a competent young woman who could fish nearly as well as her mother and shoot better than most men. Daniel had his father's build and his mother's determination, and he took to mountain life like he had been born to it. Margaret was quieter than her siblings, but had a gift for noticing details that made her an excellent tracker. Flynn and Beatrice taught their children everything they knew: how to survive, how to thrive, how to respect the land and the people who had lived on it long before settlers arrived. They taught them the value of hard work and honesty, of competence and courage. Alta grew slowly over the years, evolving from a rough mining settlement into a more established town. Beatrice's cabin near town became a summer home where they would stay during their visits, and eventually Clara announced she wanted to spend more time there to pursue education beyond what her mother could provide. It was hard for Flynn to let her go, even temporarily, but Beatrice reminded him that they had raised their children to make their own choices. Clara spent winters in Alta, living with Mrs. Chen and attending the school that had finally been established. and summers in the high country with her family. Daniel and Margaret showed no such inclination to leave the mountains. They were content with their life, and Flynn could not help but be grateful that at least some of his children had inherited his love of solitude and wilderness. The years passed, marked by the rhythm of seasons and the milestones of growing children. Flynn's hair turned gray, and Beatrice's braid showed silver threads. But they were still strong, still capable, still working side by side the way they had from the beginning. Flynn never forgot that first moment by the stream, watching Beatrice gut fish with breathtaking efficiency. It had been the moment his life changed, though he had not fully understood it then. That moment of recognition, of seeing someone who could be his true partner, had led to everything that followed. The courting, the marriage, the children, this whole rich life they had built. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Flynn and Beatrice returned to that stream near Alta, leaving the children in Mrs. Chen's capable care. They brought their knives and their baskets, and they fished the way they had that first day. Beatrice's hands were still quick and sure, though Flynn had finally gotten fast enough to at least keep pace with her. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from 2 decades of knowing each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Flynn asked. The question that had been on his mind for years. "Giving up your independence, coming to live in the mountains?" Beatrice looked at him, and her smile was the same one that had captured his heart 2 decades earlier. "I did not give up my independence. I chose to share it with you, and that has made all the difference." She finished gutting another fish, her movements still economical and efficient, and Flynn felt the same surge of love he had felt that first day. This woman, his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in every sense of the word. "I love you," he said, "just as much now as I did the day I watched you gut fish and fell completely head over heels." "I know," Beatrice said, "and I love you. Even though you still are not quite as fast as me." Flynn laughed, the sound echoing across the stream and into the mountains beyond. "I never will be, but I am fine with that." They finished fishing as the sun set, their baskets full, their hearts fuller. They walked back to Alta hand in hand, 2 people who had found each other in the wilderness and built something lasting and real. Their children grew into adults, each finding their own path. Clara became a teacher in Alta, marrying a good man and raising her own family. Daniel became a hunting guide, eventually taking over much of Flynn's old territory. Margaret married into the Ute band Flynn had befriended, bridging 2 cultures with her quiet competence. Flynn and Beatrice grew old together in their mountain cabin, their hands weathered by years of work but still capable. They still fished together, though more slowly now. They still worked side by side, though they needed more rest than they once had. And they still loved each other with the intensity of that first moment, that instant when Flynn had watched Beatrice gut fish and known she was the one. On a spring morning when Flynn was 63 and Beatrice was 57, they sat on the bench outside their cabin, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Their grandchildren were visiting, filling the cabin and surrounding area with noise and laughter. But for this moment it was just the 2 of them. "We built a good life," Flynn said, his hand finding Beatrice's as naturally as breathing. "We built a great life," Beatrice corrected. "Better than I ever imagined possible, because you could gut fish faster than me," Flynn said, grinning. Beatrice laughed, the sound as bright and clear as it had been when she was 23. "That is absolutely why. My superior fish gutting skills are the foundation of our entire marriage, and I would not have it any other way." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, surrounded by the mountains they had made their home, blessed by the family they had created, and held together by a love that had started with a simple moment of recognition and grown into something that would last the rest of their lives and beyond. The children and grandchildren came looking for them eventually, pulling them into the chaos of family breakfast and the day's planned activities. But Flynn and Beatrice carried that moment of peace with them, a reminder of everything they had built, everything they had shared, everything they still had to look forward to. Years later, when they were both gone and their children gathered to remember them, Clara would tell the story of how her parents met. How her father, a mountain man who thought he knew everything about wilderness survival, had been humbled by a woman who could gut fish better and faster than anyone he had ever seen. How he had fallen in love at that exact moment and had spent the rest of his life grateful for that moment of honest skill meeting honest admiration. And how her mother, a woman who had lost everything and rebuilt from nothing, had found in that rough mountain man someone who valued her competence over conventional femininity, her strength over delicacy, her truth over pretense. It was a love story born of mutual respect and shared capability, of two people who saw in each other not just romance but partnership. It was a love story that produced children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that shaped a whole branch of families who valued both independence and connection, both solitude and community. But at its heart, it was the story of a man watching a woman work, recognizing in her movements everything he had been searching for, and having the courage to pursue what his heart demanded. It was the story of a woman who had every reason to close herself off from love, who chose instead to trust one more time, to take one more risk, to build one more dream. It was, quite simply, the story of Flynn and Beatrice Everett, who proved that sometimes love strikes in the most unexpected moments, and that when it does, if you are brave enough to reach for it, you can build something that lasts forever. Their cabin still stands in that high mountain valley, maintained now by their descendants who use it as a reminder of where they came from. The stream where they fished runs clear and cold, unchanged by the passage of time. And on quiet mornings, if you listen carefully, you might almost hear the sound of Beatrice's laughter mixing with Flynn's deeper voice, echoing down through the generations as a testament to a love that began with fish guts and grew into legend.